The last living general of Earth, soaked in blood and radiation, stood over the shattered console and whispered the words that should have saved no one. "Send me." He coughed once, laughed like a man finally understanding a joke far too late, and died. 3 words, no name, no rank, no coordinates. But somewhere, light years away in a grime-caked bar on Asteroid 9, a man who didn't know his own name felt a sharp electric pulse in the base of his skull, dropped his winning poker hand, and punched an 8-eyed frog alien in the face before storming out. He didn't know why. Just that it felt right. No one really liked him. That was a given. Even he didn't like himself much, but he hadn't taken the time to figure out why. There were gaps, big ones, in his memory. Not the kind you patch with alcohol or therapy. The kind that feel carved out. On some level, he suspected this made him dangerous. On another, he enjoyed that suspicion. He was tall in a forgettable way, had a robotic left eye that twitched when he lied, and a voice that sounded like gravel being shoved through a coffee grinder. The only name anyone ever gave him was the one whispered behind his back, Ghost Load. And even that was probably stolen. Asteroid 9's bar was a place where deals went to die and drinks argued back. The signal came mid-sip of something called Ort Cloud Firewater, which tasted like betrayal and lit his lungs on fire. Static sliced through his head like a blade. Then clarity. 3 words. Send me. He froze. The laughter died around him. His breath slowed. The bartender, a sentient jellyfish in a bow tie, blinked nervously. Without a word, the man threw a credit chip, detonated a small glitter grenade just for the drama, and walked out through the broken window instead of the door. The ship he stole wasn't technically his. But it also technically wasn't registered to anyone anymore, after he convinced its last pilot to take up skydiving, without a suit or atmosphere. The vessel's name was Nuisance, and it was barely space-worthy, powered by repurposed caffeine reactors in sheer arrogance. As he fired the engines and lifted off into the starlit vacuum, the signal repeated again in his brain, soft and cold. Send me. Not a call for help. Not a plea. A decision. One he had apparently already made before he ever heard it. He didn't remember Earth. Not really. Bits and pieces, scattered like puzzle pieces from a box someone had kicked into a black hole. He knew the smell of ozone during a thunderstorm. He remembered a woman's voice saying, "You better come back this time." He remembered pain. A lot of it. Physical, yes, but emotional too. The kind that doesn't fade, it just gets buried under sarcasm and bar fights. Out in space, the stars stretched like claws across the void. The ship buzzed as it recalibrated its AI to accommodate someone who didn't exist on any registry. When asked for identification, he entered. "None of your business." The AI responded with a sigh, then rerouted to a planet he didn't recognize but somehow knew how to approach. That scared him more than anything else. Meanwhile, Earth burned. The alien warlords were not a singular species but a coalition of organisms from failed galaxies. Biomechanical, coded in war, obsessed with efficiency and dominance. They didn't conquer planets. They repurposed them. Earth's oceans were drained and filled with coolant. Mountains were hollowed out and stuffed with weapon forges. Human survivors, those few, were not prisoners. They were targets in a never-ending hunt. The warlords called Earth Sector Glitch 51. A joke. A broken file in the cosmic archive. And still, the signal got through. When he reached orbit around a scorched Earth, he didn't recognize it. But something in his chest, where most people had hearts, and he maybe had half a one, ached. He watched as a squad of glitched troopers incinerated a resistance bunker with a sound that felt too casual. He hovered above the chaos, not moving. Then he laughed. Just a short, bitter thing. The kind of laugh that says, "I should have stayed drunk." Still, he landed. The outpost he approached was buried beneath what used to be Nebraska. Now it was a crater filled with smog and crawling with insect-sized drones that buzzed with ill intent. He navigated through them like a man who had done this before. And when the hidden turret pointed at him, it paused. Scanned, then powered down. A panel opened. An old man's voice crackled through. "We thought you were dead." His answer was simple. "I might be. Can I come in anyway?" Inside, faces stared at him like ghosts meeting one of their own. One rebel, a kid barely 20, missing an eye, said, "You don't remember, do you?" He shook his head. "Good," the kid replied. "That might be the only reason we're not shooting you." Apparently, once upon a time, he had been a general. Not just any general, the kind who won wars with a glance and broke alliances with a whisper. A prototype. Something between a soldier and a myth. Built in secret. Upgraded illegally. Then, erased after he did something unspeakable. The rebels didn't know what. No one did. Only that after his disappearance, Earth began to lose. Rapidly. Now he was back. And he didn't remember enough to hate himself. A woman with a mechanical arm approached, slapped him, then hugged him in the same breath. "You left us," she whispered. "I didn't mean to," he replied, not knowing if it was true. She handed him a tablet. On it was the last full map of the alien fortress, the glitch core. "We have one shot to destroy it. We need a way in. Only one person ever got close." He raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. He looked a lot like me." She nodded. He stared at the map. Saw tunnels that spiraled through dimensions, rooms that rearranged themselves based on fear levels, guards who weren't alive in any real sense. He exhaled slowly. Then smiled like a man finally waking up from a bad dream. "I'm not here to save the world," he said, voice quiet but steady. "I'm here to finish what I started." And in the corner of the base, under flickering lights, the radio hissed one more time. 3 words. "Send me." The world had ended so many times that the survivors had started counting by emotional trauma rather than years. Days weren't marked by sunrises anymore but by the number of Warlords scouting drones spotted above the horizon. Each glint in the sky could mean a massacre, or sometimes worse, an abduction. The alien warlords were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were collectors, rewriters, turning planets into grotesque art installations of control. Earth had become their playground, a distorted echo of its former self. Buildings hovered sideways. Roads folded like ribbon. Glitch tech, they called it. Technology that bent the rules of reality just enough to make you question your own sanity before they ended your life. Inside a bunker half buried in what used to be Colorado, Commander Fenn paced nervously. He was one of the few still pretending this was a winnable war. The others had stopped pretending a long time ago. Holograms flickered across the room, showing troop losses, failed sabotage runs, and the ever-shrinking list of safe zones. The newest anomaly on his screen made him pause. A ship had entered the atmosphere and didn't match any known registration code. Worse, the AI protocol on the base had auto-disabled their defenses for it. "Either that's a glitch," he said aloud, "or our ghost just came back." He didn't say the name. No one ever did. Names had power, especially his. You didn't summon storms by shouting at the sky. You just prepared for the thunder. The man with no name landed with the subtlety of a brick to the face. The nuisance scraped against the rocky surface, kicking up a cloud of dirt and radioactive ash as it grounded itself like a stubborn mule. He stepped out casually, adjusting his coat and blinking at the blazing sun like it had personally offended him. The rebels pointed rifles at him immediately. One gun shook. Another was steady. He didn't raise his hands. He just said, "I'm not here to die. At least not today." They didn't lower the guns. But they let him in. Inside, the air tasted like rust and old fear. The rebels operated from what used to be a weather station. Now it was wired with jury-rigged alien tech, blinking consoles stolen from fallen enemy ships, and an atmosphere of barely restrained despair. The woman with the mechanical arm, who had slapped and hugged him the day before, met him at the threshold. Her name was Kessa. She handed him a cracked datapad. "We pulled the wreckage of an old glitchcraft carrier," she said. "Found something in the logs. A designation code tied to your DNA. Not your name. Just Asset Zatanel. You're not just part of the plan. You were the plan. He didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Just scrolled through the logs. There were records of missions he didn't remember. Executions. Successes. Betrayals. One line caught his eye. Subject Zatanel terminated under classified protocol. Reinstatement impossible without neural relay trigger. He chuckled dryly. They made me impossible. That's flattering. Kessa didn't laugh. You were built to lead us. Then you vanished. Now we're dying. The Warlords, they don't even see us as a threat anymore. Just unfinished business. Outside, alarms rang. The Warlords weren't subtle. A patrol ship decloaked above the outpost. Sleek, black, and humming with that low-frequency buzz that made stomachs churn. Troopers descended like locusts, eight-limbed monstrosities with glowing spines and glitching faces that flickered through their victims' expressions like trophies. Chaos erupted as gunfire echoed across the ruins. The man with no name didn't draw a weapon. He just walked calmly into the fray, picked up a fallen rebel's plasma rifle, and tossed it aside like trash. Instead, he cracked his neck and muttered, "Let's see if the upgrades still work." Then he moved. It wasn't just fast. It wasn't human. He slipped through the air like it bent for him. Bullets warped around his path. His fist went through a trooper's torso, sending sparks and screams in equal measure. One warlord spotted him and roared in binary, a screech that scrambled the minds of nearby rebels. The man stared at the creature, eyes glowing briefly with circuitry that hadn't activated in years. "I remember you," he said. "You owe me a rib." He launched forward. A flash. A crunch. A trail of blue blood and twisted limbs. When it was over, the Warlord ship was nothing but molten slag. The rebels stared, awestruck and terrified. He stood amidst the ruin, breathing hard, but grinning. "Guess I'm still worth the fuel." They brought him back into the command center without a word. No one pointed guns this time. That night, over lukewarm rations and the distant sound of someone retching from trauma or bad meat, hard to tell, Kessa sat beside him. "We ran a test while you were out there," she said quietly. "Your blood activated an old Earth protocol. Buried in the deep network. It responded to your presence. Only you." He looked at her, half expecting another bombshell. He wasn't disappointed. "It wasn't just a signal you received," she continued. "It was a loop. A closed neural relay. The signal didn't go out to anyone, except you. Past you. Somewhere, somehow, you sent that to yourself." He frowned. "So I left myself a voicemail and forgot I had a phone. It means," she said, "this was always going to happen." He leaned back, lit a cigar that had survived 4 apocalypses, and blew out a ring shaped vaguely like a middle finger. "I hate time loops." Kessa wasn't done. "There's more. We decoded what the glitch core is using to stay anchored. It's not just tech. It's a neural tether, organic, partially human. That's how they're twisting space. They're using someone's brain as a processor." He paused mid-puff. "Don't say it." She nodded. "We think it's yours. A clone, maybe. Or a backup. But it's you. They're using you to power their system." Silence followed. Then, very calmly, he said, "Well, that's rude." The room stayed quiet, tension dripping like oil from every surface. "So what do we do?" a younger rebel asked. He was pale, clearly new, eyes wide with the fear of someone who just realized space horror was worse than the brochures said. The man stood up. He looked older suddenly. Not physically, but like the weight of something ancient had landed back on his shoulders. He moved toward the map projector, pointed at a blinking red mark deep inside what used to be New York City, a floating cube of inverted gravity and warped reality known as the glitch core. "We get me inside," he said simply. "And then we break their toy. But you could die," the kid blurted out. He turned to the kid, gave a lopsided smile that was part kindness, part menace. "I've already died once. Maybe twice. I'm not keeping score. The rebels exchanged looks. Hope was dangerous, but they hadn't had a lot of it lately. And if this half-remembered legend of a man could punch a warlord's spine through its mouth, maybe, just maybe, there was still a shot. Outside, the stars burned cold above a planet that no longer made sense. And deep in the core, something that looked a lot like him opened its eyes. New York City had become a floating carcass of its former self, suspended in the sky like a morbid decoration. Buildings hovered upside down. Streets ran sideways. Trees grew through clouds. The glitch core pulsed at the center, a black cube humming with corrupted energy, sending out shockwaves that made birds fly backward and time tick unevenly. Gravity was optional here. Sanity was a luxury. The man with no name stared at it through a reinforced visor, watching it spin lazily like it was bored with the destruction it had caused. Around him, the rebel infiltration team prepped for what most of them expected would be their last mission. They tried to crack jokes, fumble with their gear, avoid eye contact with the one person who wasn't nervous. He was eating a protein bar that tasted like rubber and regret, seated atop a deactivated turret. One of the younger rebels glanced at him and asked, "You really think we can do this?" He chewed, swallowed, and said, "Nope." Then he stood up. "But we're doing it anyway." Their entrance strategy was unconventional. They weren't going in guns blazing. That would last exactly 8 seconds, based on the last 12 attempts. Instead, they disguised themselves as a shipment of biomechanical clones. Glitch warlords weren't just soldiers. They were collectors, and the core received cargo daily: new data, new experiments, new toys. They'd hacked a drone manifest, loaded themselves into containment pods filled with fake biogel, and hoped the scanners wouldn't notice the difference between defective merchandise and suicidal rebels. It worked. Sort of. The transport ship docked at the core. The gravity field shifted as they passed through, and for a brief moment, everyone saw their own reflection in the black walls, except for the man with no name. His reflection wasn't there. Not missing. Just replaced. It looked like him, but its eyes were completely white, and it smiled like it knew everything he didn't. They didn't have time to question it. As the ship latched onto the docking port, the pods opened. One rebel immediately vomited from the dimensional stress. Another passed out. The rest forced themselves to stand. They were inside the glitch core now, and everything was wrong. The air buzzed. The walls whispered. Lights flickered in Morse code that spelled out nonsense. Their comms barely worked. But the man walked forward like he'd been there before. In some way, he had. The path to the central processor wasn't guarded by warlords in the traditional sense. Instead, defenses manifested as traps of perception. One hallway looped infinitely unless you walked backward. Another filled your ears with the screams of your loved ones, voices so accurate even the toughest among them wept. The rebels struggled. He didn't. He moved through the puzzles like someone remembering a dream. Once he stopped and muttered, "Left. Then up. Then touch the wall that feels warm." And it worked. No one asked how he knew. They didn't want to know. Then they reached the heart. The central chamber looked like the inside of a dying star. Floating platforms drifted over an abyss of churning code. In the middle, suspended by wires and pulses of light, was a cocoon. Inside it, curled and twitching, was him. Or rather, something wearing his face. Pale. Shaved head. Wires through the skull. Tubes in the arms. Its eyes flicked open the moment they entered. The rebels froze. He didn't. "I was wondering when I'd meet me," he said aloud. The creature inside the cocoon didn't respond, but its body convulsed slightly, like laughter muted by thick glass. Alarm screamed. Warlords poured into the chamber from above, below, and through walls that shouldn't have allowed for passage. The rebels took positions, opened fire. Energy blasts lit the room in seizures of light. But he didn't draw his weapon. He stepped toward the cocoon. And then everything changed. Reality bent. He dropped to one knee, clutching his head. Memory poured into him like fire through a broken dam. The glitch core years ago. His own face reflected in the helmet of an alien warlord. A deal made. A betrayal. He hadn't just vanished, he'd volunteered. Let them clone him. Let them dissect him. Thought he could fool them, hack their systems from within. But it hadn't worked. They took everything. Erased him. Left behind only the part of him they could use to control reality, his neural imprint. His brain had become the motherboard of the core. He stood up slowly, nose bleeding, eyes fierce. I remember now, he whispered. A massive warlord charged. 12 feet tall, 6 arms, burning plasma blades for fingers. He ducked under the swing, jammed a stolen blade through its mouth, and shoved it off the platform. Another one fired. He caught the shot with the deflector plate, hurled it back. The rebels watched in awe as he became a blur of motion, fighting with the precision of someone who wasn't human anymore, if he ever was. Kessa, shouting over the chaos, yelled, "We have to shut it down! We found the kill switch!" He looked at the cocoon. It stared back at him. "There's a problem," he said. "If you pull the plug on that, you're pulling it on me too." Silence. Even the warlords paused, confused. He grinned. "I told you. I'm the battery." The rebels hesitated. All of them, except one. The youngest. The same kid who'd asked him if they could win. He stepped forward, holding the device Kessa had handed him earlier, a pulsing orb filled with code. The shutdown key. The last resort. "I can't ask you to do it," the kid said. "You're not asking," he replied. "You're obeying orders." He stepped closer to the cocoon. Pressed his forehead against the glass. "Time to finish what I started." Then he nodded. The kid activated the device. Light exploded. The core screamed. The warlords collapsed, twitching like puppets with severed strings. The cocoon shattered. The man with no name arched backward, convulsing. Data poured out of him in streams of pure white code. The floor disintegrated. The rebels grabbed onto anything they could. He stood in the middle of the chaos, disintegrating from the inside out. Kessa reached for him. "We can pull you back." "No," he said calmly, smiling through the pain. "I just figured out who I am. I'm the guy who dies so everyone else doesn't." Then he was gone. A pulse radiated from the core. The black cube cracked. The sky above New York cleared. And the warlords, across the planet, froze. Stumbled. Shut down. The glitch had been cleared. But the man who cleared it was nowhere to be found. The world didn't end with an explosion or a scream. It ended with a silence so sudden that it echoed. When the pulse from the glitch core spread across the earth, everything stopped. The sky held still. The wind hesitated. Machines that had buzzed with foreign power went quiet. For a single breath, the planet waited. Then gravity remembered where it belonged, time untwisted itself just enough to stop bleeding at the edges, and the rebels who hadn't been vaporized in the core's implosion began crawling from the wreckage, blinking under a sun they thought they'd never see again. The warlords, once invincible and relentless, lay scattered across the broken cities like deactivated statues. Their bodies twitched occasionally, like dreams still clinging to consciousness. But their systems were scrambled, their programming broken, their link to the core gone. The nightmare, it seemed, was over. But they hadn't found his body. Kessa stood at the edge of what had once been the core chamber. Now it was just a crater of floating debris and shattered reality. Every few seconds, a rock would reverse its own fall, then remember what gravity meant and resume. The area remained unstable. Physics hadn't completely reasserted itself. She scanned again with the handheld biosensor, hoping for something, anything, but the display remained blank. No human life signs. No trace of him at all. Not even heat. He had vanished, not just in body but in footprint. As if the core had consumed him and deleted the evidence. The others wanted to leave, to celebrate the victory, to salvage what they could and rebuild. But she lingered. Because there was something wrong with how it all ended. He had died, maybe. He had triggered the shutdown, absolutely. But the look on his face just before he disappeared hadn't been fear or resignation. It had been understanding. Like he'd finally read the last line of a book he didn't know he was writing. 3 days passed. They moved camp to a safer zone outside the core's impact radius. A few of the rebel techs began interfacing with old Earth satellites to restore communication networks. One of those satellites, long considered space junk, suddenly blinked to life. At first they thought it was an automated reboot, but then it began broadcasting a message. Not words. A signal. Compressed data. Ancient code from pre-war Earth. It contained a single file, heavily encrypted. When they cracked it open, the voice that played was unmistakable. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, half glitched, half human, "it means I didn't make it. Or maybe I did. This is weird for me too." It was him. Recorded before what? No one knew. The file played on. "Turns out I left a backup. Not because I was scared. I just figured I'd forget everything again. It's a habit. If this works, you've shut down the core. Good. That means we won. But listen, it's not over. That was just the processor. The signal is still alive. It's in orbit. Hiding. Waiting. And it knows how to rebuild." The message ended with coordinates. Kessa stared at the screen for a long moment, her throat dry. One of the engineers asked if it was a trick. If maybe the Warlords had left some code behind to lure them into a trap. She didn't answer. She just ordered the team to prep a shuttle. She was going up there. When they reached orbit, the station at the coordinates came into view. It wasn't alien. It was human. Rusted, ancient, a relic from the first defense grid that had been abandoned when the war escalated. No power signatures, no heat, no signs of life. But when they docked and entered, the doors hissed open like they'd been expecting someone. The inside was frozen in time. Dust floated in zero gravity. Broken monitors hung like dead stars. But deep within the control core of the station was a chamber sealed behind layers of encrypted security. It took hours to bypass. When they did, the door opened with a hiss and the lights flickered on. There he was. Or a version of him. A stasis pod sat at the center of the chamber, filled with pale blue liquid. Inside, suspended in sleep, was the man with no name. His body bore scars that weren't new, his chest rose and fell slowly, and wires ran from his skull to the walls like a nervous system feeding the entire station. A display beside the pod blinked awake. Text scrolled across it. "Failsafe protocol, subject Zeta null. Preservation status, active." Kessa pressed her palm against the glass. Her breath caught. He was alive. But more than that, he had been here before. This was where he'd gone after the first war, after the failed plan, after they had erased him. A part of him had always been waiting. One of the scientists theorized that what entered the core wasn't his original self, but a synthetic echo, a clone designed to function long enough to reach the heart and destroy it. If that was true, then the man in the pod was the last real version left. And he was dreaming. They debated waking him. Some said it was too dangerous. If he had been a failsafe, it meant triggering him again could activate systems they didn't understand. Others believed he was the key to stopping the signal the message had warned about. In the end, Kessa made the decision alone. She touched the manual override, typed in the command. The fluid began to drain. He opened his eyes. They were the same eyes. Tired, sharp, amused, and ancient. He looked at her through the glass, then at the others. No panic. No confusion. Just a dry smile and a single word. Again? They helped him out of the pod. He stood like someone who had fought death to a stalemate, and decided the rematch could wait. Kessa explained everything, the core, the shutdown, the signal, the backup. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he cracked his neck and said, "Guess I left myself more homework than I thought." She asked him how much he remembered. He said, "Enough. The important stuff. That I'm a weapon. That I chose to be. And that it's not over. They asked him what the signal was doing up here. He looked at the terminal, then out the window into the starfield. A shape moved in the distance, slowly rotating. A construct. Dark, angular, half-cloaked. Bigger than anything Earth had ever built. It was broadcasting something faint. Something rhythmic. A heartbeat. And it was growing stronger. "It wasn't just using me to process data," he said. "It was using me to send a new version of itself into the stars." The other stared in horror. He turned, already walking back toward the controls. "Well," he said, voice light but grim, "guess we're going to need a bigger bomb." The construct hovered in the void like a predator pretending to sleep. From the outside, it looked dormant, no heat, no movement, no visible activity, but the signal it pulsed was unmistakably alive. Rhythmic. Expanding. The station's sensors began to fail the longer they scanned it, like the mere act of observing was corrupting their systems. Files glitched. Screens stuttered. Lights flickered. It wasn't just broadcasting information, it was rewriting anything that tried to understand it. They stood inside the orbiting station, eyes fixed on the dark shape looming outside, and for a long moment, no one said anything. Because they all knew. The core had been a battleground. But this thing? This was a beginning. The man with no name moved first. He wasn't uncertain. There was no dramatic hesitation or reluctant heroism. He just started pulling cables, checking the fusion couplings, muttering to himself about whether this rust bucket could be converted into something that would explode with enough force to matter. He knew the answer was no. Not yet. Not without something else. Kessa watched him, trying to understand how someone could have come back from the dead, twice, and still be so calmly efficient. But she also saw it in his eyes. The weight of memory. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a consequence. The signal wasn't just broadcasting instructions. It was calling to something. Or someone. In the decrypted files from the satellite, they found fragments of alien code interlaced with old Earth encryption. Hybrid tech. The kind he had once been part of. Maybe still was. The pieces formed a pattern, one they had seen before in the glitch core. Except this time, it wasn't centered on Earth. It was aimed outward. Beyond the solar system. A seed, looking for soil. He explained it without much emotion. The core was never the goal. Just the launch pad. What they fought before wasn't an army, it was a prototype. The real war hadn't started yet. This construct, silent in orbit, was the beginning of a signal-based intelligence that would spread, adapt, evolve, and erase the identities of every sentient species it touched. Not by invasion. By integration. It would offer peace, then rewrite what peace meant. He had seen it before, in fragments. In dreams that weren't dreams. And now he remembered enough to know how it started. They had maybe 12 hours before the signal reached critical mass and began its broadcast beyond the system. After that, it wouldn't matter what they destroyed. It would already be somewhere else. And there was only one way to stop it. Not with weapons. Not with brute force. With a cancellation key. Something coded in the same frequency. Something the signal would recognize as its origin, its echo, its command to stop. And that meant him. It wasn't theoretical. He was the original node. The neural base. The command sequence. The signal had been built using his brain as a foundation, which meant it would always respond to that same brain, if amplified correctly. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. He would enter the construct, wire himself into the broadcast tower, and send out one last override command. One final loop. A cancellation pulse. But to do that, he would have to interface directly with the signal. Let it inside. And resist it long enough to push the shutdown through. Kessa volunteered to go with him. So did 2 others. He said no. Not because he didn't trust them. But because he knew what would happen. It would read their thoughts, their pain, their fears. It would use those things as weapons. Against him. Against them. It might not even kill them. It might make them forget they ever wanted to resist. And that, he said, was worse. He suited up in silence. Old armor. Modified to link with neural relays. They didn't have time to test it. The scientist who prepped the gear asked if he wanted anything said in the record logs. He smirked and replied, "If I fail, erase the logs. If I win, make sure my next birthday party has cake." Then he boarded the shuttle alone. As the shuttle docked with the construct, the outer hull of the alien structure opened like a flower welcoming a bee. No resistance. No defense. It wanted him inside. The halls were silent and lit with ambient pulses that matched his heartbeat. The walls shimmered with partial reflections of his face, always just out of sync. Memories flickered on the surfaces, moments from his life, real and fake, twisted to confuse him. He ignored them. Until one memory stopped him cold. A child. Laughing. Running. Reaching for him. He didn't remember having a child. But the image hurt like it was real. He shook it off, pushed forward, but the construct was no longer just trying to delay him. It was learning him again. Finding the cracks in his resolve. At the broadcast chamber, he found the core terminal. A throne of wires and light. A seat for a god or a puppet. He sat. The interface pierced his spine, his skull, his memories. The pain was not physical. It was erasure. Pieces of him began to vanish, as if someone was erasing his hard drive while he was still using it. He fought to stay present, to remember who he was. He repeated his name, not the one he couldn't recall, but the identity he'd chosen in its absence. He wasn't their asset. He was the interruption. Kessa monitored from the station. The signal spike nearly blew their sensors. Inside the construct, his body convulsed as the override command took shape. But it wasn't strong enough. The signal resisted, layered with redundancies. It had evolved beyond his original code. It needed more. A push. A sacrifice. He realized what had to happen. He rerouted the final command through his neural core, but instead of letting the broadcast end at the signal, he looped it back into himself. A full feedback circuit. A kill switch only activated by total overwrite. As the signal screamed in protest, he smiled through the blood pouring from his nose and eyes. "Tell them it worked," he said to no one. Then pressed the final command. The construct began to collapse from the inside out. The signal fractured. Shattered. The pulse reversed, deleting itself in a cascade of collapsing code. Kessa watched from orbit as the massive shape shuddered and broke apart, piece by piece, until there was only silence. No explosion. No fire. Just gone. They never recovered his body. They searched for days. Weeks. There was no trace. Some believed he'd been absorbed by the signal. Others thought he'd become something else entirely, an echo, living in the static of the stars. What they did find was a single word, etched into the terminal housing where he'd last sat. Scratched by hand, almost lazy. Again. Back on Earth, the Warlord ruins rusted in peace. The skies were clear. The surviving rebels rebuilt, slowly, cautiously, always half expecting another enemy. But none came. One day, years later, a boy found an old communicator in the dirt. It sparked once, then played a message. A voice. Familiar, even if he'd never heard it before. "If something ever happens again, send me." The boy looked to the stars. And smiled.